Welcome to my walkthrough of the frequently made mistakes for assignment 2B. First, as always, please make sure you document your code. Too many people are still submitting solutions that don't document what they're doing, so make sure you do that. Also, make sure to address my comments from earlier assignments. And third, I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but make sure that all the unit and integration tests are passing. A number of people simply have way too many mistakes that clearly have been caught by the unit and integration tests. So either you're not running them or you're running them and you're not coming to office hours to get help to make sure that those problems are fixed. So make sure you do that. It'll save a lot of time in the review process. Let's take a look at some problems that are left over from earlier assignments. Here's something from assignment 1B. Something very important is missing here. So the mOwner field is going to be initialized to null, which will cause chaos and insanity when you try to run the program. So make sure you initialize your Java fields properly. Here's a problem left over from assignment 2A. This condition expression down below is incorrect. Please go back and rewatch the frequently made mistakes video I put out on assignment 2A for more details on what's wrong here and what to do to fix it. Now let's transition into real legitimate problems from assignment 2B. So first of all, don't use atomic integer here. It's way too heavy weight. Instead, you just want to use an int with the appropriate type qualifier that will meet the requirement above that the values of this field aren't going to be cached by multiple threads. Let's now come down here and take a look at another problem from simple Semaphore. Here, once again, something's missing. We need to be able to put in the appropriate type, and you need to make sure that this is going to work properly. This is really the same problem as mentioned up here, except up here we had the person using atomic integer. Down here, the person just using a naked int. Both of those are wrong. Down here, please don't allocate the field twice. You need to only allocate it once in the constructor, and also make sure you always use the super type, not the subtype, to define the fields. So there's a super type that ReentrantLock implements. Make sure you use that. And then down here, this code makes no sense putting a Boolean. What you need to do is have a condition that's initialized with a condition object. And we'll see more about those problems when we look into the constructor below. So down here, a number of people surprisingly had mistakes with the simple Semaphore constructor. You need to make sure you initialize all the fields properly. And so don't just initialize the lock, but you have to initialize permits, you have to initialize the condition. This code makes no sense because you shouldn't be using a Boolean here. So I'm not sure what this is trying to do, but it's clearly wrong. Let's now go ahead and turn our attention to the acquire method implementations in simple Semaphore. And you'll see once again, there's a whole bunch of problems. First, you need to be using a condition object, not the Java built-in monitor condition. That really doesn't make any sense. And you don't want to be using a Boolean here. So you need to rethink how this works. Also, don't be using compare and set, and don't be using atomic integer. Instead, just decrement the permits count by 1 using the good old minus operator. Here's another problem. Make sure that you always have the calls to lock interruptibly or lock, when it's appropriate to use lock, outside of the try block. It should be before the try block in particular. And then down here, you don't need to be calling signal. Acquire doesn't call signal. The method that releases the Semaphore calls signal, but acquire doesn't call it. And you don't need to have a catch clause here at all. There's no need to catch an exception here. Looking down now into acquire uninterruptibly, this code, I'm not even sure what this is doing, but it's way too complicated. You don't need to re-implement all this stuff here. This should just be making a call to the acquire method, and we'll see some examples of that here in just a second. Here's another problem. This code is an attempt to implement try uninterruptibly, but there's no loop, so this doesn't follow the specification. Note that you do not need to call mlock lock, and likewise, you don't need to call mlock unlock when you're done. All that logic is done for you automatically by the acquire method. And make sure that once acquire returns successfully and doesn't have an interrupt exception, that you break out of the loop, either with break or return, because otherwise it won't break out if you put a loop around this thing. When you have the catch interrupted exception catch clause, don't print a stack trace here. There's no need to do that. Also, don't be calling thread.currentThread.interrupt here. Instead, please set a Boolean flag and then check that outside of the loop and call the interrupt method if the flag is true. This implementation is inefficient and also won't work properly if acquire happens to clear the interrupt flag. Also, don't put a break after the interrupt occurs. That's precisely what you don't want to do. If an interrupt occurs, you want to keep looping. So this, of course, needs to have a loop. And as we talked about before, you don't need to call unlock because that's done by acquire. So now let's turn our attention to problems with the release method. Once again, make sure the calls to lock and lock interruptibly go outside of the try block. And this call should be lock interruptibly, not lock. Also, make sure you only call signal when the number of permits is greater than 0. And then also, you don't need to have a catch clause and you don't need to be printing a stack trace. So in general, you don't want to be printing stack traces inside of methods that are meant to be used for things like reusable classes, such as a semaphore. No sense in gumming up the user console with messages that won't be meaningful to users. Other problems with release, you need to make sure that you increment the permits before checking to see if the value is greater than 0, so this doesn't make any sense. And also down here, this logic is incorrect. It's decrementing when it should be incrementing, and also don't use atomic integer. Instead, you want to be using just good old int with the appropriate type qualifier. Looking down now into ReentrantLock HashMap Simple Semaphore Manager, please use map instead of HashMap. Please use the supertype of ReentrantLock, not the subtype ReentrantLock. That's the same problem that people had been doing with the Simple Semaphore as well. And also make sure you do the right syntax for HashMap. There should be some types here. You don't want it to just be the naked generic type. That's not the right way to do generics. A bunch of different problems in build model. Please use mpalantiri map.size, assuming you called the field mpalantiri map. Don't use keyset.size. That's unnecessary. And at least for the moment, don't use getPalantiri count. We have a bug in the unit test, which we're going to fix for the next release. But right now, just stick with mpalantiri map.size and things should be well. Also, you should just go ahead and create a good old hash map. You don't need to be making a linked hash map, and you don't need to have these parameters. You can simply do this, and the compiler knows what you're talking about. Down here, read the specification. If you're implementing the Java graduate student version, then you need to use a Java stream here as opposed to the for each method. And down here, there's a problem because this particular code is calling the available permits method on an uninitialized instance of Semaphore, namely this thing here, while we're trying to initialize Semaphore. So of course that won't work. You get a null pointer exception. And make sure you don't pass in true here because we want this to be a non-fair lock. We don't need to use a fair lock. There's no sense in paying the overhead for a fair lock. So just use a good old, either use this or use the version that passes in false, but don't pass in true. Let's take a look at some problems here with the acquire method. You don't need to check to see if you've been interrupted. That's overkill. You don't need down here to put a try finally block around the acquisition of the semaphore. That's also unnecessary. This method throws interrupted exception. So if acquire throws interrupted exception, you're perfectly fine. Please don't use keyset. Please don't use get. Please don't use put on the Palantiri map. Instead, if you're doing the undergrad version of the code, what you want to do is you want to use entry set, and then you want it to loop through the map entry, which would, of course, contain the Palantir and its available status as a Boolean. And in that case, you don't need to use put and get at all. Instead, you can use the set value and get value methods defined on the map entry that'll be used here in this for each loop. So important thing to avoid doing because you don't want to make your code inefficient. Some more problems with acquire. This is sort of the grad student version. This code is unfortunately redundant. There's no need to set the value of the map element twice. And so please refactor the code so it will be cleaner. This can actually be cleaned up quite a bit, in fact, to use a pair of method references that are much cleaner. Let's take a look at yet another problem with acquire. So this expression for filter is way too complicated. Just use a method reference. Likewise, you also don't need to do something like this. This is also too complicated. Use a method reference for all this stuff, and you'll find that your code is much cleaner. And if we go down here, you should also, if you're going to do it this particular way, you need to replace the getKey method with this lambda expression that will go ahead and set the value of the entry to false, and then go ahead and return the key. So there's several different ways to do it, but don't do it in a redundant way that's inefficient. And this code in particular is still inefficient because it uses a put call down here when it shouldn't need to. It should be able to fix that up here in the map call. There's a couple different ways to do this, but that would be the cleanest. Down here, looking into the release method, there's a whole bunch of problems here. You don't need to be using the contains key method. It's unnecessary and inefficient, and it's also not thread safe the way this code is implemented, so that's also bad. Make sure that you acquire the lock interruptibly, not non-interruptibly, or basically the default behavior, and that's because release can throw the interrupted exception, so it's fine to use lock interruptibly. Bunch of subtlety around this. We talked about this earlier when I went over this in class, but basically the replace method can return 3 different values. It can return false, which is what you want it to return if all goes well, and it should return true if there's a problem and you pass in, you've messed up the Palantiri earlier in the acquire method, the Palantiri map, and it'll return null if you give it a Palantiri that is not in the map. And I should also mention, you really want to use replace here. You don't want to use put. Put has some bad things. So get in the habit of using replace, not using put. So in any case, you need to refactor this code to make it handle those 3 different cases properly. When you decide to throw the illegal argument exception, make sure you pass in a string saying, invalid Palantiri or whatever you want to say, but don't just say nothing. And then here's a somewhat subtle situation. Make sure that you release the semaphore after you call unlock. We talked about that in one of the quizzes we did recently, and there's a reason for this. And the reason has to do with trying to minimize contention when things go your way. So those are the various frequently made mistakes that I saw when I reviewed people's code. Please take a look at my comments on your code. Please also make sure you run the unit tests. Sometimes I miss some of the mistakes people make when I review the code, because after reviewing 35 submissions in the span of a day, it gets a little blurry after a while, but I should have captured everything here. So if you have some weird problems and you're getting errors from the unit tests or the integration tests, please come back, watch this video carefully, and if you are still having problems, don't hesitate to post to Piazza or come to office hours.